In this video, I want to talk about my plan for the budget planner. If you saw my last video, I went over my entire financial advisor, financial planner that I have, and talked about some of the different features that I've already implemented and where I want to go with that. If you'd like to check that out, go back to my last video and take a look there. Going on from here, I have a few general requirements for this budget planner. They include budget categories need to be dynamically assignable. This means if I want to add groceries as a budget category, I can add groceries, or utilities or rent or anything. So you can assign whatever budget categories you want, and my budget can look different than your budget. Another requirement that I have to meet is categories should have a simple, editable overview. This means those categories that for the budget need to be able to be editable. You need to be able to edit the description, the name of them. They will have a color associated with them, which I'll get into later. You should be able to easily edit those. So that's another requirement. And then the last one for general requirements is that data can be imported and exported from the application. When creating a budget, you're going to spend a lot of time creating these categories, adding and removing expenses, and you want to be able to import and export that data with ease, so that way you don't leave the web page and find out all of your data is lost. Some expense-specific requirements include being able to easily add, remove, and edit expenses. If you make a new purchase, if you return something from your purchase, or return an entire purchase in its entirety, you should be able to modify that expense. You should be able to filter and sort throughout all of your expenses. Here I have listed category, amount spent, expense name, and date. These are different fields within the expense, and you should be able to sort and filter based on those values. Lastly, I want default values to be provided if they're not filled in by the user. If you don't know the cost of something, but you know it's going to be an expense, you can add it, and then later you can add the amount that you spent. Or if you want to give it an uncategorized category, a default would be uncategorized, and later on you can put it into a specific category. Some of my technical specifications include the languages that this will be programmed in: HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. I'll be using React as my JavaScript framework. Redux will be used for data management. I'm going to be adding this as a feature to my financial advisor application. And then files will be saved and loaded as a JSON format. There could be a unique file extension that I can create to prevent incompatible imports, but it's not really necessary. It would just be an additional feature if I would want to add it. Now I want to get into some of the specific objects that I need to create for this project to succeed. In my previous projects, I had explained how I reorganized all of my data halfway through the project and had to restart. For this project, I want to go in with a plan and know what all of my objects will look like, so then I can build features around them. And before even starting coding, I'm going to know if this data layout will work for what I want to do. My budget planner object will be split up into two different items. One is a list of categories and one is a list of expenses. The list of categories will be budget category objects, and the expenses will be expense item objects. The budget category object needs an ID, a name, a description, a budgeted amount, whether or not it's an income source, a color that associates with the tile, so each tile will need to be a color, and then a list of the expenses associated with it. Each list item refers to an ID of the expense item object. My expense item object is going to contain an ID similar to the categories, a name, the date that the purchase was made on, an amount, and then the category that this item associates with. Some of the constants that I'm going to need include budget category fields, expense fields. These will make it easier to update specific fields instead of having to update the entire budget category object or expense object, along with the actions that can be taken on the budget category or expense items. These I found having a constant for these, it makes it a lot easier when calling these functions from your React components. My next step is to write all my unit tests. Unit tests should be created for all of my public and private functions, and those unit tests can assume that the expense list and the category list are empty. Writing unit tests should be done before the functions are written. That way I can provide my outcome and write my functions for my outcome instead of writing my functions and then testing the function I just wrote. It verifies that my functions do what I want them to do, and I'm not just testing something that I know already happens. Now getting into some of my functions, I want to start out with private functions. These are intended to be very specific functions that do one specific task. And the public functions are going to be intended to combine some of these smaller tasks to create one larger action. For private budget category functions, we have adding a budget category, removing a budget category, and updating a budget category. Now, some edge cases I have in here is that when you remove a budget category, this doesn't handle removing the ID from the linked expense. This will be handled by the larger public function. And then all of these are going to be returning budget planner categories list objects. For private categories expenses functions, these are going to be specifically the budget category expenses list, and it's going to be adding expenses to a category, adding multiple expenses to a category, and removing an expense from a category. These will return an updated budget planner categories expenses list. None of these functions will update the budget planner expenses list though, so these are some of my edge cases. Next up, we have the private functions for expenses. These include adding, removing, and updating expense items. And then when you update an expense item through this function, I have specified that budget category expenses will not be updated if you change the budget category through this function. And then set list of expenses to uncategorize. This would be if you're deleting a category, you can call this function to just update every single expense in that list to be uncategorized. And then these all return a budget planner expenses list. Lastly, we have the private getter functions. I have a retrieve expenses from category function. This is going to return a list of expense IDs associated with a specific category. I find this will probably be useful when deleting a category. I can get that list of expenses beforehand and then handle those later. And then retrieve expense category ID from expenses. This is specifically getting the expense category from a specific expense. Now getting into the public functions, these functions are intended to be larger actions that combine a lot of those smaller actions. So creating a category, we are going to create a budget category and then add it to the budget categories list, and adding an empty list of expenses. Removing a category, it's going to retrieve the expense IDs, update each of those IDs categories to no category, and then remove that item from the budget planner object categories list. Modifying a category, this is going to update the specific field based on the expense category field's constant, and then return a budget planner object. For some of the expenses public functions, creating expenses, removing expenses, modifying expense fields, and modifying expense category, these are very similar to the budget category functions. They're just related to expenses, and they will take a lot of those private functions and combine them to create larger actions. Once again, these are returning budget planner objects. The first component I want to talk about is the category tile. For this, I want to use the two-sided flippable tile. So one side is going to show all the basic information, like the name and the available budget for this specific month that you're in. And then on the back, it's going to show details, and this is where you can edit all of your category information as well. So name, description, budgeted amount, whether it's an income source, and the color. The front is going to be read-only. The back is going to have an option to delete that category. And I'm planning on using React Card Flip for this, which is a component that I found. Now that we have a category tile, we're going to want to display those tiles in a nice, easy to manage format. So I need a category panel. This should be populated with all of the budget categories, and there should be a button available to add new categories. Removing a category is going to be available on the category tile, as we saw before, and then new tiles are created with defaulted information, and then once you click on that tile and edit it, that's when you can get your specific unique information. For adding new expenses, I want a nice simple form that allows a user to just input their information and add their expense. The harder it is to add an expense to a budget, the less likely you are to fill out your budget every month or whenever you make a purchase. So I want this to be nice and simple. So here I just put a name, a date, an amount, a category, and the button should be nice and big so you can just move your mouse over and click on it nice and easily. Next, we have the expenses table. For this, I want to have a nice simple table with the ability to delete and edit each row, and then the ability to sort and filter through all of my different categories. I think it'd be useful to have a filter by date so you can put a range of dates in, and it only shows items from that range of dates. Maybe you can select last 3 months or last 6 months, and it's going to filter based on that query. There's still a lot of unknowns in here, but I believe given this basic UI design, I should be able to come up with a good way to filter and sort that's super user-friendly. Importing and exporting data is likely going to be the most complex of these components. Web apps usually rely on having data on a server that you can interact with, that maybe you have login permissions to be able to retrieve your personal data. But for this app, I don't want to have a user require a login in order to view their data. I want them to have it on their own system so that they can, at will, just come into the app, upload their data, view everything, make their changes, and then download it back to their system. So for this component, I have a very simple UI layout, but the back end of this component is likely to be fairly complex. At this point, we have all of our objects, functions, and UI components designed. All we have left is combining all of the components in a user-friendly manner. In my coming videos, I'm going to take you along my journey coding all of these components and discussing the solutions and roadblocks that I run into. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope this helped you understand all of the steps that I take when planning a new project. And if you liked the video and you'd like to see more like this in the future, please like and subscribe. If you have any programming tips and tricks that work well for you, leave them in the comments for me and the other viewers to see. Thanks for watching.